It started with the ticking, subtle, rhythmic, and maddeningly persistent. It seemed to follow Silas everywhere. At first, he thought it was his alarm clock, an ancient relic from his grandfather's attic that he stubbornly kept on his nightstand. He held the clock to his ear that morning, shaking it once for good measure, but the ticking didn't falter. The sound wasn't coming from the clock. By mid-afternoon, Silas noticed it again, a faint tick-tick-tick, just at the edge of his perception, like a dripping faucet he couldn't locate. It was there in the office, underneath the hum of the fluorescent lights and the clatter of keyboards. It was there in the elevator, blending with the groan of cables and the faint jazz music. And it was there when he sat in his car during his lunch break, staring blankly at the dashboard. He rubbed his temples and shut his eyes, leaning back in his seat. "I need to sleep," he thought. Though he couldn't pinpoint the last time he'd felt genuinely rested. Life lately had been a blur of spreadsheets, deadlines, and the endless grind of survival. But sleep wouldn't fix this. Not when the ticking wasn't out there, but inside him. That realization struck later that evening as Silas stood in the shower, the scalding water tracing over his shoulders. He tilted his head to listen again, forcing himself to be still. It wasn't coming from the pipes or the walls. The ticking came from his left arm. "Impossible," he whispered, his voice trembling as he turned his arm over under the stream. At first glance, his skin looked normal, pale, freckled, and faintly veined beneath the harsh bathroom light. But when he pressed his fingers against his forearm, he could feel it, a rhythmic vibration beneath the surface, faint but undeniable. Panic flared in his chest as he grabbed the edge of the sink for balance. His mind raced. "It's just in my head. It's stress. It's dash." The skin on his arm shifted. Not dramatically, just a small, barely noticeable lift, like a ripple running under the surface. Silas froze, his breath catching in his throat. Slowly, trembling, he scratched at the spot with his nail. The skin peeled away like damp wallpaper. It wasn't blood or raw flesh that greeted him beneath. It was metal, intricate and gleaming under the harsh light. Tiny cogs and wires shifted beneath the layer, impossibly alive, moving in perfect harmony with the ticking sound. "No," Silas breathed, shaking his head as if denial alone could make it vanish. The skin flap he'd peeled away hung loosely, dangling like some grotesque strip of synthetic fabric. He pressed it back into place, but it didn't stick. It wouldn't stick. He stumbled backward, his heart hammering. He grabbed a towel, wrapping it around his arm as though covering it could erase the reality of what he'd seen. The ticking grew louder, echoing in his skull, drowning out his thoughts. Silas sat on the edge of his bed, still damp and shivering. His laptop screen glared back at him, open to a search engine. He'd typed and erased a dozen phrases, skin peeling to reveal metal, ticking sound in body. Arm feels like a clock. Each query seemed absurd, his hands shaking too hard to type coherently. Instead, he stared at his arm, still wrapped in the towel, as if it might do something else. The metallic sheen beneath his skin was burned into his mind, replaying like a loop. He thought about calling someone, his sister, a doctor, anyone, but the thought of explaining what he'd seen felt ridiculous. They'd laugh, or worse, they'd think he was losing his mind. As he debated his next move, a faint memory surfaced, something he hadn't thought of in years. When he was 8, he'd been in a car accident. The details were blurry, pieced together from what adults had whispered when they thought he wasn't listening. Experimental surgery, they'd said. lucky to survive. Had something been done to him back then? Something they'd never told him? He flexed his fingers instinctively, and the ticking sound seemed to shift, almost responding to the movement. A cold sweat broke across his brow. That night, Silas didn't sleep. He lay rigid, staring at the ceiling, listening to the relentless ticking emanating from his arm. Each second felt like a hammer striking an anvil, louder in the stillness of the dark. His thoughts spun, wild and untethered. He imagined himself ripping his own arm apart, clawing through layers of skin and sinew to uncover the full scope of what lay beneath. But what terrified him most wasn't the ticking or the metal or the memories he couldn't fully trust. It was the feeling growing deep in his chest, a terrible certainty that the ticking wasn't just random. It was counting down to something. As dawn broke, Silas couldn't take it anymore. He grabbed a pair of scissors from the kitchen drawer, gripping them tightly in his hand. He pulled back the loose flap of skin on his arm, gritting his teeth as the edge of the blade touched the surface. And then he froze. Beneath the thin layer of metal, etched in tiny, perfect script, was a number: 72 hours. A countdown, glowing faintly, began to tick down. 71 hours, 59 minutes, 59 seconds, 71 hours, 59 minutes, 58 seconds. Silas stumbled back, scissors clattering to the tiled floor. His arm throbbed faintly, not from pain, but from an unfamiliar tension. A hum of energy coursing just beneath the metal surface. The glowing countdown etched into the machinery beneath his skin pulsed rhythmically, synchronized with the maddening ticking sound. What does it mean? What happens when it hits zero? He clenched his fists, his breath coming in shallow gasps. The glow dimmed when he flexed his arm, then brightened again as he released it. It was as though the countdown responded to his movements, mocking him with its relentless march toward an unknowable end. Silas spent the day in isolation, pacing his apartment. He hadn't dared leave, hadn't dared call anyone. What could he possibly say? "Hi, I think I'm not human anymore, and my arm is counting down to something." He shook his head, rubbing his temple until it ached. His laptop sat open on the coffee table, its screen cluttered with search results. None of them made sense. Half-baked conspiracy theories, fringe medical studies, and sensationalist articles about robotic prosthetics. But buried among the noise, he found a name: Corvus Industries. The name ignited something deep within his subconscious, an almost tangible recognition. He tried to remember, grasping at fragments of a memory just out of reach. Sterile white rooms, fluorescent lights, the smell of antiseptic. He hadn't thought about the car accident in years, but now, every detail from that day seemed to claw its way back to him. Except they didn't feel real. They felt implanted, like a memory replayed too many times in a faulty machine. By evening, the countdown read 68 hours, 14 minutes, 03 seconds, and his body had begun to betray him further. His left hand, once sluggish from the tension in his arm, now moved with unnatural precision. Objects he once fumbled with, his phone, a glass of water, now felt feather-light in his grasp. He could grip and maneuver them with mechanical efficiency, but the sensation was wrong. The texture of the glass didn't register. The weight of his phone felt alien in his fingers. Even his senses were warping. The ticking in his arm was no longer the faint background noise it had been. It dominated his hearing, louder than the creak of the floorboards beneath his feet, or the muffled drone of traffic outside. He thought he heard whispers beneath the ticking, indistinct and fleeting, like words spoken through static. The worst came when he touched his chest absent-mindedly. He felt the faintest vibration, steady and rhythmic, just below his sternum. He yanked his shirt off and stared into the bathroom mirror, his reflection pale and trembling. The skin over his chest seemed too smooth, artificial. He clawed at it with shaking hands, but it wouldn't give. Not like his arm had. Not yet. Silas made a decision. He couldn't sit in his apartment waiting for the countdown to hit 0. Whatever Corvus Industries was, whatever it had done to him, it was his only lead. He rummaged through the closet, pulling on a hoodie to hide the growing metallic sheen creeping up his forearm, and set out into the night. The address he'd found for Corvus Industries was an industrial park on the outskirts of the city. It wasn't far, but every step felt heavier than the last, his paranoia growing with each passing block. The streets seemed emptier than usual, the air unnervingly still. The ticking in his arm grew louder as he neared the industrial park, as though his body were urging him forward. The building was a squat, nondescript structure with no signs or logos, its windows dark and its parking lot overgrown with weeds. Silas hesitated at the entrance, his hand trembling as he reached for the rusted door handle. He pulled it open, and a wave of sterile, ice-cold air washed over him. Inside, the space was cavernous, filled with rows of dormant machines that looked decades out of use. Dust hung in the air, illuminated by the faint green glow of emergency lights. Silas stepped cautiously, the sound of his footsteps swallowed by the oppressive silence. The ticking in his arm quickened. At the far end of the room, he spotted a desk. Unlike the rest of the room, it was clean, the surface free of dust. Papers were neatly stacked, and a sleek, modern monitor flickered faintly. Silas approached it with a mixture of dread and curiosity. The monitor's screen displayed a single message. "Welcome, Unit L7. Proceed to termination protocol." "Termination," Silas whispered, his voice cracking. The screen flickered again, displaying a map of the building with a red dot marking his current location and a path leading to a room labeled Core Maintenance. The countdown on his arm glowed brightly, now reading 66 hours, 42 minutes, 15 seconds. Silas didn't want to go deeper, but something compelled him. His legs moved almost involuntarily, his body responding to an unseen directive. As he followed the path, the whispers he'd heard earlier grew louder, echoing off the walls of the empty facility. They weren't random anymore. They were coherent. "You're not broken," one voice hissed. "Return to the source," another said. "You are incomplete." Silas reached the marked door, his heart pounding in his chest, or what was left of it. He hesitated, staring at the keypad beside the door. Before he could decide whether to go through, his hand moved on its own, pressing a sequence of buttons he didn't recognize. The door slid open with a hiss, revealing a darkened room lit only by a pulsing blue glow. In the center was a cylindrical chamber, its glass walls frosted with condensation. Silas stepped closer, his breath fogging up the glass. Inside the chamber was a figure, identical to him, but lifeless, its body fully mechanical, the face a cold, metallic imitation of his own. The figure's chest bore the same countdown, glowing faintly. 66 hours, 41 minutes, 59 seconds. Silas staggered back, clutching his arm as the ticking reached a deafening crescendo. He fell to his knees, the world spinning around him as a single, horrifying thought consumed his mind. I was never real. The figure in the chamber twitched, its eyes snapping open. Silas's countdown ticked down to 66 hours, 41 minutes, 58 seconds, and the whispers converged into a single, chilling command: replace him. Silas scrambled back from the chamber, his heels skidding on the cold, smooth floor. The metallic figure inside stared at him, its unblinking eyes glowing faintly blue. It twitched again, its fingers curling, then relaxing, the movements eerily lifelike. "No," Silas muttered, shaking his head. "This can't be happening." The whispers grew louder, overlapping, echoing through his mind as if they emanated from within him. Replace him. Replace him. Replace him. The ticking in his arm reached an unbearable pitch, faster and louder than before, like the frantic beat of a drum. Silas clutched his forearm, his nails digging into the skin, or what was left of it. The synthetic covering began to tear away in long, curling strips, revealing the intricate machinery beneath. His fingers no longer felt like his own, their movements too fluid, too perfect. The figure in the chamber stepped forward, the glass panel sliding open with a hiss. Silas froze as it emerged, its footsteps unnervingly silent. Every detail of its appearance mirrored his, down to the faint freckles on its synthetic face. But its eyes were hollow, cold, and unfeeling. "What do you want?" Silas shouted, his voice cracking as he backed into the wall. The figure tilted its head, studying him with an almost clinical detachment. Then it spoke, its voice a distorted, metallic echo of his own. "I am you," it said. "No, you're not," Silas screamed, his voice breaking with a mixture of rage and fear. The figure's hand shot out, gripping Silas's wrist with inhuman strength. Pain radiated through his arm, not from the grip, but from within, as though the machinery under his skin was responding to the figure's touch. "You are defective," the figure said, its tone devoid of emotion. "I am the replacement." Silas struggled, but the figure was stronger, faster, more precise. It twisted his arm, exposing the glowing countdown embedded in his chest. The numbers ticked away relentlessly, now at 66 hours, 39 minutes, 12 seconds. "What happens when it reaches 0? Silas gasped, his voice trembling. The figure didn't answer. Instead, it turned its gaze toward the cylindrical chamber it had emerged from. Silas followed its eyes and saw what he hadn't noticed before. Another chamber, identical to the first, but empty. A faint glow pulsed inside, the same hue as the countdown on his arm. The realization hit him like a freight train. The chambers are for replacements. One for the new unit, one for the old. "Termination protocol," Silas whispered, the words catching in his throat. "That's what happens at 0, isn't it? I get replaced." The figure released his wrist, and for a moment, Silas thought it would let him go. But then it raised its hand, pointing toward the empty chamber. "Enter," it commanded. Silas shook his head violently. No, I'm not going in there." The whispers grew deafening, a cacophony of voices chanting in unison. "Replace him, replace him, replace him." Desperation surged through Silas. His survival instincts overrode his fear, and he lunged at the figure, driving his shoulder into its chest. They both stumbled back, the figure's movements jerky and inhuman as it regained its balance. Silas didn't wait for it to recover. He grabbed a nearby metal rod, a discarded piece of equipment, and swung it with all his strength. The rod connected with the figure's head, sending it staggering to the side. Sparks erupted from its exposed machinery, and for a brief moment, Silas felt a flicker of hope. But the figure straightened almost immediately, its head snapping back into place with a sickening crack. "You cannot fight what you are," it said, its voice eerily calm. "I'm not like you," Silas shouted, swinging the rod again. This time the figure caught it mid-swing. Its grip tightened, bending the rod effortlessly before tossing it aside. Silas stumbled back, his chest heaving, his mind racing for a way out. The countdown now read 66 hours, 37 minutes, 44 seconds. The room itself seemed to pulse with energy, the glowing chamber behind the figure humming louder. Silas's eyes darted around, searching for anything he could use. Then he saw it, a control panel on the far wall, its screen displaying a series of options. One of them read, "Emergency shutdown." Silas made a split-second decision. He feinted to the right, drawing the figure's attention, then bolted toward the panel. His legs moved faster than they ever had before, powered by the unnatural strength that had begun to consume his body. The figure was on him in an instant, its hand clamping down on his shoulder. Silas cried out, the pain searing as the machinery in his body seemed to rebel against him. But he pushed forward, slamming his hand onto the control panel and hitting the shutdown command. A deafening alarm blared, and the room plunged into darkness. The only light came from the faint blue glow of the countdown on Silas's chest and the dim, flickering eyes of the figure behind him. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the chamber the figure had emerged from began to hum, its glow intensifying. The figure turned toward it, its movements suddenly frantic. "No," it said, its voice breaking into static. "The protocol is incomplete. Termination must..." Before it could finish, the chamber emitted a burst of light, and the figure froze mid-step. Its body spasmed, the glow in its eyes flickering out as it collapsed to the floor. Silas stood trembling, his chest heaving as he stared at the lifeless form. But his relief was short-lived. The countdown on his arm didn't stop. It continued ticking, the numbers now reading 66 hours, 36 minutes, 12 seconds. He looked back at the control panel, hoping for answers, but the screen was blank. His reflection stared back at him, distorted by the cracked glass. His face was pale, his eyes hollow. The whispers returned, softer now, more insistent. "You cannot stop it. You are the prototype. You are not real." Silas fell to his knees, clutching his arm as the ticking grew louder, drilling into his mind like a relentless hammer. The glow from the empty chamber intensified, its pulsing light casting sharp, jagged shadows across the room. He didn't need to wonder anymore. The truth was undeniable. The countdown wasn't just connected to him, it was him. Every second lost wasn't just marking time, it was unraveling his existence. Whatever waited at zero, he wasn't meant to survive it.